The Hinds County coroner has identified the 3 victims killed in Saturday night's triple homicide in Jackson. The victims are identified as 25-year-old Kiana Weathersby, her 2-year-old son, Kamari Givens, and 30-year-old Erica Weathersby, Kiana's sister and the child's aunt. Jackson police say the 3 were found shot multiple times inside a home on Queen Alexandria Lane Saturday night.
Late on the evening of the 27th of June, 2026, in Jackson, Mississippi. By the time the first officers stepped through the front door, they knew this was no ordinary emergency. What they discovered inside would launch one of the city's most closely followed homicide investigations in recent memory. Inside the home were Kiana Weathersby, her sister Erica Weathersby, and Kiana's young son, Kamari Given. 3 members of the same family whose deaths would leave investigators, loved ones, and an entire community searching for answers. As detectives began securing the scene, one thing stood out almost immediately. This didn't appear to be a random crime. Whoever was responsible seemed to know exactly where to go and exactly who they were looking for. In the hours that followed, investigators worked methodically to reconstruct the family's final days. Every witness interview, every surveillance video, every piece of forensic evidence, and every new lead helped reveal another piece of a puzzle that was far more complex than anyone first imagined. But even as the investigation gained momentum, one question remained at the center of everything. Why this family? The answer would lead detectives through a complicated web of relationships, carefully examined evidence, and unexpected developments that transformed this case into one of the most closely followed investigations in Jackson. And even after arrests were made, some of the most important questions still remained. Before we continue, we want to let you know that this documentary discusses the loss of multiple members of one family, including a young child. We've intentionally avoided graphic descriptions and focused instead on the verified facts, the investigation, and the pursuit of justice. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Consider subscribing for carefully researched true crime documentaries built on verified evidence, thorough investigation, and respect for every victim and their loved ones. And to everyone who continues to support this channel through your views, comments, likes, and shares, thank you. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures the people at the center of them are never forgotten. Let us know where you're watching from. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because this story didn't begin with flashing police lights or crime scene tape. It began days earlier, with a family going about their everyday lives completely unaware that everything was about to change. Before investigators began piecing together evidence, before police appealed for information, and before arrests turned this into one of Jackson's most closely watched investigations, there was simply a family whose lives revolved around one another. At the center of that family was Kiana Weathersby, a 25-year-old mother whose world centered on raising her young son. Those who knew her described her as kind, hardworking, and devoted to her family. While much of her private life remained just that private, the people closest to her consistently painted the picture of someone focused on providing a stable life for her child, rather than seeking attention or living in the spotlight. Living alongside her was her older sister, Erica Weathersby, who was 30 years old. Family members described the sisters as being extremely close. Their relationship went beyond simply sharing the same last name. They depended on one another, supported one another, and spent much of their daily lives together. In difficult moments, they leaned on each other, creating a close-knit household that revolved around family rather than conflict. That same home was also where 2-year-old Kamari Given was being raised. Publicly available information shows that Kiana was Kamari's mother, while Erica played an active role in helping care for him. According to family members, the two sisters were raising the little boy together, sharing the responsibilities that come with caring for a young child. It was a family arrangement built on cooperation, one that reflected the close bond between the sisters. As news of the tragedy spread across Jackson, one voice captured the family's heartbreak more than any official statement could. Their brother, DeMarco Bailey, stepped forward to speak publicly about the people he had lost. Rather than focusing on headlines or speculation, he spoke about his sisters as hardworking women who stayed focused on their family and about a little boy whose future had only just begun. More than anything else, Bailey made it clear that he wanted justice not only for his sisters, but also for his young nephew. His words reflected the overwhelming sense of loss felt by those who knew the family best. The tragedy also shook the neighborhood around Queen Alexandria Lane. Residents described the news as deeply unsettling, not simply because of the number of lives lost, but because many struggled to comprehend how something like this could happen so close to home. Neighbors who spoke with local media recalled an ordinary residential area where nothing appeared out of the ordinary before emergency vehicles arrived that night. What had been another quiet weekend quickly became the focus of an intensive investigation that would draw attention across Mississippi and beyond. City leaders echoed those concerns. As Jackson continued to confront a rise in violent crime during 2026, officials acknowledged that this case struck a particularly painful chord within the community. Beyond the investigation itself, many residents were left asking how an entire family could become the focus of such a devastating act. The questions were immediate, but the answers were far less clear. At this stage, investigators had not publicly explained why this family had been targeted or what events had led to that night. Those answers would only begin to emerge as detectives reconstructed the timeline, interviewed witnesses, and examined every available piece of evidence. Before they could understand who was responsible, they first had to understand everything that happened in the days leading up to the crime. As detectives began assembling the first pieces of the investigation, one question quickly rose above all the others. Why had this particular family been targeted? It was a question that spread through the neighborhood, across social media, and eventually into newsrooms throughout Mississippi. But despite the growing public interest, investigators were careful not to rush to conclusions. One detail became clear early in the investigation. According to Jackson Police Chief Rashal Brackney, detectives did not believe the attack was random. That statement immediately changed the direction of public conversation. Rather than searching for a chance encounter or an unknown intruder, investigators were examining the relationships surrounding the victims and everyone connected to them. Even so, police stopped well short of explaining why they had reached that conclusion. During multiple public briefings, Chief Brackney confirmed that investigators believed the people involved knew one another, but she declined to elaborate on the nature of those relationships. She explained that revealing too much while the investigation was still active could compromise the case, influence witness testimony, or alert other individuals. Investigators were still trying to identify. That distinction is important. At this stage of the investigation, law enforcement had not publicly identified a motive. They had not released evidence describing the history between the victims and the suspects. They had not announced whether the case involved a personal dispute, financial conflict, retaliation, or any other specific circumstance. While speculation spread rapidly online, investigators repeatedly emphasized that those theories did not come from them. Their focus remained on collecting evidence rather than commenting on possibilities. As the investigation progressed, authorities identified Cornelius Carter and Jordan Carter as suspects. One point that immediately required clarification was their shared surname. Police specifically stated that despite both men being named Carter, they are not related. That clarification was made to prevent confusion as information about the case continued to circulate publicly. Beyond identifying the suspects, investigators remained cautious about discussing how each individual allegedly fit into the case. Public statements at the time did not describe the specific interactions between the suspects and the victims before the incident, nor did investigators explain what evidence ultimately connected them. Those details remained part of the active investigation and, later, the court process. That measured approach reflected a broader goal of protecting the integrity of future prosecutions rather than satisfying immediate public curiosity. Investigators also signaled that the case might involve more than the people already publicly identified. During court proceedings and subsequent updates, police indicated they were continuing to pursue additional leads and had not ruled out the possibility that others could have played a role. That message reinforced that the investigation was still developing, even as arrests began to take shape. For the victim's family, however, those unanswered questions only deepened the pain. Publicly, they continued to seek justice while waiting for investigators to reveal what had led to the loss of 3 members of their family. For detectives, every answer would have to come from evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court, not from assumptions or public pressure. At this point, investigators believed they understood who they needed to focus on. What they still had to reconstruct was how the events unfolded before that night, and whether there were warning signs hidden in the days leading up to the crime. That timeline would become the next critical piece of the investigation. In many major investigations, detectives begin by reconstructing the final days before a crime. They look for anything that stands out, a change in routine, an unexpected visitor, unusual phone activity, or conversations that suddenly take on new meaning. In the Jackson triple homicide investigation, that process became one of the first priorities. Investigators needed to establish not only what happened on the night of June 27, but also whether there had been any warning signs in the days leading up to it. Based on the information released publicly, the Weathersby household appeared to be following its normal routine. There were no official reports suggesting that neighbors had witnessed disturbances in the days before the incident, nor did investigators announce any previous emergency calls to the residents that would immediately explain what was about to unfold. From the outside, nothing publicly indicated that the home on Queen Alexandria Lane would soon become the center of a major homicide investigation. As detectives began interviewing relatives, neighbors, and anyone who may have interacted with the family, they worked to establish the victim's final confirmed movements. Investigators sought to determine who had last seen Kiana Weathersby, Erica Weathersby, and young Kamari Given, what they had been doing in the hours before the incident, and whether anyone unfamiliar had been seen near the residence. These early interviews were essential, not because they answered every question, but because they helped investigators build a reliable timeline based on verified facts rather than assumptions. Another critical task was documenting the family's recent communications. Detectives routinely examined phone records, text messages, and other digital evidence to understand a victim's final known contacts. While authorities confirmed they were conducting a thorough investigation, they did not publicly disclose the contents of those records or identify any specific conversations that influenced the direction of the case. That restraint reflected the fact that the investigation was still active, and preserving sensitive evidence was considered essential. Investigators also worked to verify the movements of vehicles connected to the case. Determining when certain vehicles arrived, departed, or were last observed can often narrow investigative timelines. At this stage, however, law enforcement had not publicly released a detailed minute-by-minute reconstruction of the family's final hours. Instead, detectives focused on gathering surveillance footage, speaking with witnesses, and comparing every piece of information to establish an accurate sequence of events. The neighborhood itself became an important source of information. Residents were asked to report anything unusual, no matter how insignificant it seemed. A vehicle parked where it normally wasn't, unfamiliar faces in the area, or sounds that might not have drawn attention at the time could all become valuable once placed alongside forensic evidence. Investigators understood that even the smallest observation could help clarify what happened before officers were ever called to the scene. Despite those efforts, many questions remained unanswered. Authorities had not publicly explained exactly when the victims were last seen alive, who had been in contact with them during their final hours, or whether there had been any immediate indication that they were in danger. Those unanswered questions only reinforced the importance of the investigation's next phase. By the end of this early timeline reconstruction, detectives had gathered enough information to focus their attention on one critical period, the night of the 27th of June, 2026. It was during those hours that investigators believed the key events unfolded, setting the stage for an investigation that would soon intensify as officers responded to a scene unlike any they had expected. By the evening of Saturday, the 27th of June, 2026, investigators believe the events that would define this entire case had already begun unfolding inside a home on the 300 block of Queen Alexandria Lane. Exactly what happened during those final moments has never been fully detailed by law enforcement, but the official timeline released by investigators provides the first clear picture of how the case came to the attention of authorities. At approximately 10:10 p.m., the Jackson Police Department received a 911 call reporting an aggravated assault at the residence. At that moment, dispatchers had no indication they were sending officers to what would soon become one of the city's most significant homicide investigations of the year. The information relayed to responding officers suggested an emergency requiring immediate attention, but the full scale of the incident would only become clear once they reached the address. Patrol officers were dispatched without delay, arriving within minutes to secure the property and assess the situation. What confronted them immediately changed the nature of the call. Instead of responding to a single reported assault, officers discovered 3 members of the same family inside the residence who showed no signs of life. Additional police units, emergency medical personnel, and investigators were requested to respond as the scene rapidly transformed from an emergency call into a major homicide investigation. As emergency responders completed their initial assessment, the priority shifted from rendering aid to preserving every possible piece of evidence. Officers established a secure perimeter around the home, restricting access to anyone not directly involved in the investigation. Crime scene personnel, homicide detectives, and supervisory officers began arriving one after another, each assigned a specific role in documenting and protecting the scene before anything could be disturbed. Those first decisions would prove critical, because every observation made during those initial minutes could later become important evidence. Shortly afterward, Hinds County Coroner Jeremiah Howard arrived to begin the official process of confirming the deaths and documenting the scene alongside investigators. The victims were later identified as Kiana Weathersby, 25, her sister Erica Weathersby, 30, and Kiana's 2-year-old son, Kamari Given. Confirming their identities allowed detectives to begin notifying family members while simultaneously expanding the investigation beyond the residence itself. Outside the home, the normally quiet neighborhood quickly filled with emergency vehicles. Flashing lights illuminated Queen Alexandria Lane as officers moved methodically between the residents and their patrol vehicles, while detectives began organizing the first phase of what they knew would be a lengthy investigation. Residents watched from a distance as investigators worked through the night, many unaware of the full extent of what had happened, until information slowly began emerging through official statements and local news coverage. Jackson Police Chief Rachel Brackney soon addressed the public, confirming that detectives were treating the case as a triple homicide. While she emphasized the seriousness of the investigation, she was equally careful about what she chose not to reveal. Detectives were still determining the sequence of events, identifying everyone who had been at or near the residence, and establishing how the incident had unfolded. Releasing too much information during those first hours, she explained, could jeopardize witness interviews and compromise the integrity of the investigation. Investigators also confirmed another crucial development. During the incident, a red 2020 Mitsubishi Mirage belonging to one of the victims was taken from the residence. Detectives immediately believed the vehicle could play an important role in identifying those responsible. Rather than waiting for additional evidence to surface, Jackson police released the vehicle's description and license plate information to the public, asking residents across the region to remain alert. It was one of the earliest investigative decisions made public and demonstrated how quickly detectives were working to generate leads while the case was still in its earliest stages. Despite the urgency of the investigation, authorities remained disciplined in their public messaging. They did not speculate about a motive, identify potential suspects, or describe the relationship between the victims and whoever was responsible. Those questions remained unanswered. Instead, investigators focused on collecting evidence, documenting the scene, interviewing witnesses, and following every lead that emerged during those critical first hours. By sunrise, detectives had already reached one important conclusion. Based on the evidence collected at the residence and the circumstances surrounding the incident, they did not believe this had been a random act. But determining who carried it out and building a case that could withstand scrutiny in court would require far more than the evidence found at the scene. The next breakthrough would come as investigators began tracing every lead, every witness, and every piece of physical evidence left behind. With the victims identified and the crime scene secured, the investigation entered a new phase. The urgency of the emergency response gave way to something far more methodical. Detectives knew the answers would not come from assumptions or public speculation. They would come from evidence carefully collected, carefully examined, and placed into a timeline that could withstand scrutiny in court. Throughout the night and into the following morning, homicide investigators worked alongside crime scene specialists to document every part of the residence. Every room was photographed, measured, and recorded before anything was moved. The objective was straightforward: preserve the scene exactly as it had been found, so investigators could later reconstruct the sequence of events with as much accuracy as possible. At the same time, officers began expanding the investigation beyond the home itself. Detectives started identifying everyone who might have information about the victim's recent activities. Family members, neighbors, friends, and anyone believed to have interacted with the household in the days leading up to the incident became part of a growing list of interviews. Even details that appeared insignificant at first could become valuable once compared against other pieces of evidence. Investigators also began assembling a detailed timeline. Every confirmed sighting, every verified conversation, and every documented interaction had to be placed in chronological order. Establishing when the victims were last seen, who had contact with them, and what occurred before officers arrived was essential. Detectives understood that even a small inconsistency could reveal an important lead or eliminate an incorrect assumption. As information continued to come in, one piece of evidence quickly drew particular attention: a red 2020 Mitsubishi Mirage belonging to one of the victims. Authorities confirmed that the vehicle had been taken from the residence during the incident, making it more than just missing property. Detectives believed it could provide valuable insight into the movements of the people involved and potentially connect locations, individuals, or events that were not immediately apparent at the crime scene. Recognizing its importance, the Jackson Police Department released the vehicle's description and license plate information to the public almost immediately. The appeal extended beyond Jackson, asking residents throughout the surrounding area to remain alert and report any sightings. It was one of the earliest public indications that investigators believed the vehicle could play a significant role in moving the case forward. That strategy paid off. Before long, the Mitsubishi was located abandoned in Manhattan Park in North Jackson. Although police did not publicly disclose what investigators recovered from the vehicle, they confirmed it would undergo a thorough forensic examination alongside evidence collected from the residents. Rather than rushing to conclusions, detectives treated the recovered vehicle as another carefully documented scene, preserving its condition while specialists searched for anything that could assist the investigation. While physical evidence was being processed, investigators continued coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies. Jackson police confirmed that the investigation had grown beyond a single department, with assistance from state and federal partners, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The collaboration allowed detectives to pursue leads more quickly, compare information across jurisdictions, and dedicate additional resources to what had become one of the city's highest priority investigations. Behind the scenes, investigators were also evaluating information provided by witnesses. Detectives compared statements, verified timelines, and separated confirmed facts from assumptions or rumors. In any major investigation, conflicting accounts are common during the first few days. Rather than accepting every statement at face value, investigators carefully tested each claim against the evidence that had already been collected. Only information that could be independently verified would become part of the official case. As public interest intensified, so did questions directed at law enforcement. Many wanted to know whether detectives had identified suspects, whether the victims had been specifically targeted, and what investigators believed had motivated the attack. But throughout multiple media briefings, Police Chief Rachel Brackney remained deliberate in her responses. She confirmed the detectives were making progress, yet she consistently declined to discuss specific evidence, investigative findings, or the nature of the relationships involved. For some observers, that limited communication created frustration, but experienced investigators often withhold critical details for a reason. Information known only to those directly involved can help detectives evaluate witness credibility, identify false confessions, protect ongoing interviews, and preserve evidence that may later be presented in court. Releasing every detail too early risks compromising the investigation long before prosecutors ever present a case to a jury. Chief Brackney did, however, make one point unmistakably clear. Based on the evidence collected during the early stages of the investigation, detectives did not believe the attack had been random. Beyond that, authorities remained cautious. They refused to speculate publicly about motive or disclose what evidence had led investigators to that conclusion. Instead, they continued following the facts wherever they led. By the end of those first critical days, investigators had transformed a chaotic crime scene into a structured investigation built on evidence, interviews, and careful analysis. Every lead was being tracked. Every witness account was being examined. Every piece of physical evidence was being documented. And as detectives compared those pieces one by one, the investigation began moving in a very specific direction. The next breakthrough would not come from chance. It would come from following the evidence exactly where it led. As investigators continued examining every lead, the case gradually shifted from gathering information to identifying the people they believed were responsible. The early days had been spent securing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing the timeline. Now, detectives were comparing those pieces side by side, looking for the connections that could establish probable cause. One of the earliest breakthroughs came from the recovery of the victim's red 2020 Mitsubishi Mirage. Finding the vehicle was important, but detectives understood that recovering it was only the beginning. They needed to determine where it had been, who had been inside it, and how it fit into the sequence of events they were carefully building. While investigators have never publicly disclosed every finding from their examination of the vehicle, they confirmed that it became a significant part of the broader investigation and helped move detectives closer to those they believed were involved. At the same time, investigators continued reviewing witness information collected during the first several days of the case. Every interview was measured against the physical evidence already gathered. Detectives looked for consistencies, verified timelines, and identified details that could be independently confirmed. Rather than relying on a single statement, they built the case by comparing multiple sources of information until a clearer picture began to emerge. Police also continued receiving information from the public. After releasing details about the stolen Mitsubishi, residents across Jackson and surrounding communities responded with tips. As is common in high-profile investigations, not every lead proved useful. Even so, detectives carefully evaluated each report, knowing that one credible observation could provide the missing link needed to advance the investigation. Behind the scenes, investigators from multiple agencies continued sharing information and coordinating their efforts. Jackson police worked alongside state and federal partners, comparing evidence, reviewing investigative findings, and following every credible lead. That collaborative approach allowed detectives to test emerging theories against the available evidence while ensuring that no potential connection was overlooked. Although investigators were making steady progress, they remained disciplined in what they shared publicly. They did not reveal the specific evidence connecting individuals to the crime, nor did they disclose the investigative steps that had led detectives toward particular persons of interest. Those details remained confidential as authorities continued building a case that would ultimately need to withstand close examination in court. Preserving the integrity of that process remained a higher priority than satisfying public curiosity. As investigators refined the timeline, they became increasingly confident that the incident had not been random. The evidence pointed toward individuals they believed had direct knowledge of the victims and the events surrounding the crime. Exactly how detectives reached that conclusion has not been fully disclosed, but by this stage, the investigation had progressed far beyond the uncertainty of the first night. The focus had narrowed, and detectives were preparing for the next phase. For the victim's family, the public still knew very little about what investigators had uncovered. From the outside, it appeared that police were releasing only limited updates. In reality, much of the investigative work was taking place away from cameras and press conferences, where detectives quietly assembled evidence, verified facts, and worked to establish the legal foundation required for an arrest. Then came the breakthrough investigators had been working toward. The evidence had led detectives to specific individuals, and law enforcement was ready to act. Before we continue, if you've stayed with us this far, you've probably noticed that we approach true crime a little differently. We don't chase rumors or sensational headlines. We follow the evidence, verify the facts, and tell these stories with respect for the victims and the people seeking answers. If that's the kind of true crime documentary you appreciate, consider subscribing. We'd love to have you with us as we continue uncovering cases like this. The investigation was about to move from collecting evidence to confronting the people detectives believed could answer the questions that had haunted this case from the very beginning. By the time investigators were ready to act, the case had entered a new phase. Days of interviews, evidence collection, and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies had steadily narrowed the investigation. While police continued to withhold many of the details that led them to this point, they had reached a level of confidence that allowed the investigation to move from gathering evidence to locating the people they believed were responsible. The breakthrough came less than 48 hours after the investigation began. On the 29th of June 2026, Jackson police announced that 2 suspects had been identified: Cornelius Carter, 24, and Jordan Carter, 27. As their names quickly spread across news reports and social media, one point required immediate clarification. Although both men shared the same last name, Police Chief Rochelle Brackney confirmed they were not related, putting to rest speculation that the investigation involved members of the same family. Instead, detectives treated each suspect as an individual whose actions and alleged role would be examined separately as the case moved through the justice system. By that stage, investigators still had not disclosed the full extent of the evidence that led them to the 2 men. Authorities deliberately avoided discussing the specific witness statements, physical evidence, or investigative findings that established probable cause. That information remained part of the active case and would ultimately be presented through the legal process, rather than public briefings. What investigators did reveal was how the arrests unfolded. According to Jackson police, officers located a vehicle connected to the investigation and attempted to conduct a traffic stop. Instead of pulling over, the driver continued, prompting a pursuit involving multiple law enforcement units. The pursuit eventually came to an end, and both suspects were taken into custody without further incident. For detectives who had spent days following every available lead, the arrests marked a significant milestone, but they also represented the beginning of an entirely new phase of the investigation. Investigators now had the opportunity to question the suspects while continuing to compare their statements against the evidence that had already been collected. Following their arrests, Cornelius Carter and Jordan Carter were booked into custody and each faced 3 counts of capital murder in connection with the deaths of Kiana Weathersby, Erica Weathersby, and Kamari Given. It is important to remember that a criminal charge is an allegation, not a conviction. At this stage, prosecutors believed they had sufficient evidence to bring those charges, but the responsibility of determining guilt would ultimately belong to the court. Even after announcing the arrests, investigators remained remarkably disciplined in what they shared publicly. They declined to explain the motive behind the crime or describe the precise relationship between the suspects and the victims. Chief Brackney reiterated that releasing sensitive information too early could jeopardize future court proceedings and potentially affect the integrity of the investigation. The priority remained building the strongest possible case, rather than revealing every detail to the public. The investigation also did not stop with the arrests. Detectives continued executing follow-up interviews, reviewing additional evidence, and pursuing outstanding leads. Authorities made it clear that they were not treating the case as closed simply because 2 people had been taken into custody. Every piece of evidence still had to be analyzed, every witness account had to be verified, and every investigative step had to meet the legal standards required for prosecution. As the community absorbed the news, many residents felt a sense of relief that suspects had been identified so quickly. But relief was accompanied by another question that had yet to be answered. Why? Despite days of intensive investigative work and the announcement of serious criminal charges, police still had not publicly explained what they believed had motivated the attack. For the victim's family, that unanswered question remained one of the most difficult parts of the case. For investigators, however, the focus remained exactly where it had been from the beginning, following the evidence wherever it led and protecting the integrity of a case they knew would eventually be tested inside a courtroom. With the arrests complete, public attention shifted from the investigation itself to the official statements coming from law enforcement. The next chapter would reveal what investigators were prepared to share and, just as importantly, what they deliberately chose to keep confidential. With 2 suspects in custody, many expected investigators to finally explain what had happened and why. Instead, law enforcement continued to release information carefully and in stages. While the arrest marked a significant milestone, detectives made it clear that the investigation remained active, and protecting its integrity took priority over satisfying public curiosity. In the days following the arrests, Jackson Police Chief Rochelle Brackney addressed the public through a series of media briefings. Standing before reporters, she acknowledged the community's demand for answers, while emphasizing that investigators could only disclose information that would not compromise the case. It was a measured approach, one intended to preserve the evidence, protect witness testimony, and ensure that future court proceedings would not be affected by premature public statements. One of the most important messages delivered by Chief Brackney was that investigators believed the attack had been targeted, not random. Although that assessment reassured residents that authorities did not believe there was an ongoing threat to the wider community, it also generated a new wave of questions. If the victims had been specifically targeted, what had led detectives to that conclusion? And what relationship, if any, existed between the victims and the suspects? Those questions remained unanswered. Chief Brackney repeatedly declined to discuss the motive or explain the nature of the connection between the individuals involved. She also refused to identify the specific evidence that had led investigators to seek charges. While some members of the public interpreted that silence as a lack of transparency, experienced investigators often take this approach in complex homicide cases. Publicly revealing sensitive evidence too early can influence witness testimony, compromise follow-up interviews, or provide future defendants with information that could complicate the prosecution. Investigators also confirmed that the case remained larger than what had been announced publicly. Detectives continued reviewing evidence, conducting additional interviews, and following every lead that emerged after the arrests. Law enforcement stressed that an arrest does not end an investigation. In many cases, it opens the door to additional evidence that can only be obtained once suspects are in custody, and investigators have more opportunities to compare statements, verify timelines, and examine newly developed information. Another point emphasized during the briefings was the level of cooperation between agencies. Jackson Police continued working alongside state and federal partners, sharing information and coordinating investigative efforts. That collaboration reflected the seriousness of the case and ensured that detectives had access to additional investigative resources as they prepared the case for prosecution. Throughout the investigation, Chief Brackney remained consistent in her messaging. She thanked the public for providing information, encouraged anyone with additional knowledge to come forward, and reminded residents that even seemingly minor details could still prove valuable. Investigators were determined to verify every fact before presenting the case in court, and they continued to rely on community cooperation while maintaining strict control over sensitive aspects of the investigation. As reporters continued pressing for answers, another question began to emerge. Would the two arrests be the end of the case, or were detectives still searching for others who may have played a role? Authorities did not rule out either possibility. Instead, they reiterated that the investigation remained active and that additional updates would be provided only when they could be confirmed. That cautious approach underscored a principle that had guided detectives from the very beginning. Every public statement needed to be supported by evidence rather than speculation. For the victim's family, the arrests represented meaningful progress, but they did not bring complete closure. The legal process was only beginning, and many of the answers they were seeking would have to emerge through the courtroom rather than police briefings. With the investigation transitioning into the judicial system, attention now turned to the next stage of the case. Prosecutors would begin presenting the charges, defense attorneys would enter the proceedings, and the courts would determine how the evidence gathered by detectives would ultimately be tested under the law. The arrests of Cornelius Carter and Jordan Carter marked a major turning point, but for investigators and the victim's family, they were never considered the finish line. An arrest is one milestone in a homicide investigation, not the conclusion. Detectives still had to ensure that every piece of evidence could withstand scrutiny in court, while prosecutors began preparing for what would become the next critical phase of the case. Shortly after being taken into custody, both men were formally charged with 3 counts of capital murder in connection with the deaths of Kiana Weathersby, Erica Weathersby, and Kamari Given. Under Mississippi law, those charges reflected the seriousness of the allegations presented by investigators. However, as with every criminal case, the charges themselves did not constitute proof of guilt. Both defendants were presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in court. As news of the arrest spread across Mississippi, the victim's family finally saw the investigation moving toward accountability. While the arrests could never undo what had happened, they offered reassurance that detectives believed they had identified those responsible and were prepared to present their findings through the legal system rather than in the court of public opinion. The first court proceedings focused less on the details of the crime and more on the legal process ahead. During the suspects' initial appearances, the court formally advised them of the charges they faced while prosecutors outlined the seriousness of the allegations. Investigators were still actively working the case, and much of the evidence remained under seal as preparations continued. One of the first major decisions concerned bond. Given the nature of the charges and the circumstances surrounding the investigation, the court denied bond for both defendants. Prosecutors argued that the severity of the allegations, combined with the ongoing investigation, justified keeping the defendants in custody while the case moved forward. The court agreed, ensuring that both men would remain detained pending future proceedings. Even with the arrests completed, investigators deliberately avoided discussing the evidence that formed the basis of the prosecution's case. Reporters repeatedly asked whether forensic findings, witness testimony, or other investigative discoveries had directly linked the suspects to the crime. Law enforcement declined to answer those questions. That decision was intentional. Experienced investigators understand that publicly revealing key evidence before trial can create unnecessary challenges later in court. Witnesses may unintentionally alter their recollections after hearing information released through the media. Potential jurors can be influenced by details taken out of context. Defense attorneys also gain early insight into investigative strategy before prosecutors are prepared to present their case. By limiting public discussion, detectives protected both the investigation and the judicial process that would follow. Chief Rochelle Brackney remained consistent throughout every public briefing. She acknowledged the community's desire for answers, but emphasized that the investigation was far from over. Detectives continued reviewing evidence, following additional leads, and completing the extensive work required before prosecutors could move confidently toward trial. Authorities also confirmed that the investigation remained active despite the arrests. Detectives continued conducting follow-up interviews, reviewing newly received information, and examining evidence collected throughout the investigation. In complex homicide cases, an arrest often generates additional leads as new witnesses come forward or previously reluctant individuals decide to speak with investigators. Police made it clear that every credible piece of information would be examined before the case progressed further. For the victim's family, however, the legal process represented a different kind of challenge. The rapid pace of the investigation had now given way to a judicial system that often moves much more slowly. Court hearings, legal filings, and procedural requirements would take time, requiring patience from a family that had already endured unimaginable loss. While investigators had achieved significant progress, the pursuit of justice was now entering a stage where every decision would be made inside a courtroom rather than at a crime scene. The Jackson community continued watching closely as the case advanced. Residents who had followed the investigation from the first emergency call now waited for prosecutors to present the evidence they believed connected the defendants to the crimes. Many of the questions that had captured public attention since the beginning, including the motive and the full sequence of events, would ultimately be answered, if at all, through testimony and evidence presented under oath. By this point, the investigation had accomplished its immediate objective. Detectives had secured the crime scene, followed the evidence, identified suspects, and brought the case into the judicial system. But for the Weathersby family, the measure of justice had never been the arrests alone. It would be determined by what happened next, as the courts weighed the evidence and the community continued remembering the 3 lives at the center of the case. The documentary's final chapter looks beyond the legal proceedings to examine the lasting impact this case had on a family, a community, and the enduring importance of pursuing justice through facts, evidence, and due process. As the case entered the court system, the headlines gradually became less frequent. The flashing emergency lights disappeared from Queen Alexandria Lane, and news crews eventually moved on to other stories. But for the people who loved Kiana Weathersby, Erica Weathersby, and Kamari Given, life would never return to what it had been before the night of the 27th of June, 2026. For investigators, bringing charges against Cornelius Carter and Jordan Carter represented the culmination of countless hours of work. Detectives had reconstructed the timeline, interviewed witnesses, followed physical evidence, recovered a critical vehicle, coordinated with state and federal partners, and assembled a case they believed was supported by probable cause. Yet they also understood that an investigation does not end with an arrest. The responsibility of determining guilt belongs to the courts, where evidence is tested, witnesses are questioned, and every allegation must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Throughout the investigation, Jackson Police Chief Rashal Brackney consistently emphasized that detectives would allow the evidence, not speculation, to guide the case. That philosophy shaped every stage of the investigation. Rather than responding to rumors or public pressure, investigators remained focused on preserving evidence, protecting witness testimony, and ensuring that the integrity of the judicial process was never compromised. It was a reminder that in cases attracting widespread attention, patience and accuracy are just as important as urgency. For the victim's family, however, the legal process could never erase what had been lost. Public statements made by family members reflected not only grief, but also a determination to see justice pursued through the courts. They asked the public to remember Kiana, Erica, and Kamari not because of the circumstances surrounding their deaths, but because of the lives they lived, the relationships they shared, and the memories they left behind. The case also left a lasting impression on the Jackson community. Residents who had watched the investigation unfold from the very beginning were reminded how quickly ordinary lives can be changed by extraordinary events. Community members supported the victim's family, shared information with investigators, and followed the legal proceedings with the hope that every decision would be based on verified evidence rather than public opinion. Cases like this also demonstrate why careful investigative work matters. In the hours immediately following a major crime, rumors often spread faster than confirmed information. Social media can amplify assumptions long before detectives have an opportunity to verify them. Throughout this investigation, law enforcement repeatedly resisted that pressure, choosing instead to release information only when they believed it could be confirmed. While that approach sometimes frustrated those seeking immediate answers, it reflected the principle that successful prosecutions are built on facts, not speculation. As of this documentary, the judicial process continues to determine the outcome of the charges brought in this case. Court proceedings will ultimately decide how the evidence is evaluated and what conclusions can legally be reached. That distinction remains one of the most important aspects of any criminal investigation. Arrests begin the legal process, they do not conclude it. Beyond the courtroom, this case serves as a reminder of the importance of thorough investigative reporting. Looking beyond headlines allows us to understand not only what happened, but also how investigators piece together the truth, how the justice system functions, and why every verified fact matters. Most importantly, it reminds us that every criminal case begins with real people whose lives extend far beyond the news coverage. Kiana Weathersby, Erica Weathersby, and Kamari Given were far more than names in a police report. They were family members, loved ones, and part of a community that continues to feel their absence. If there's one lesson to take from this case, it's that justice is rarely immediate. It is built patiently through evidence, due process, and the dedication of investigators committed to uncovering the truth. That process may not always move as quickly as the public hopes, but its purpose is to ensure that the facts, not assumptions, determine the outcome. Thank you for watching this documentary. If you appreciate carefully researched true crime documentaries that prioritize verified facts, thorough investigations, and respect for victims and their families, consider subscribing for future cases. Your support allows us to continue producing in-depth documentaries that go beyond the headlines and focus on the truth behind each investigation. Until next time, thank you for watching, stay safe, and remember that behind every case is a family whose story deserves to be told with accuracy, fairness, and respect.